This is Deb Donig with Technically Human, a podcast about ethics and technology, where I ask what it means to be human in the age of tech. Each week, I interview industry leaders, thinkers, writers, and technologists, and I ask them about how they understand the relationship between humans and the technologies we create. We discuss how we can build a better vision for technology, one that represents the best of our human values. My guest today is Avi Tuschman, the founder of Cricket AI, an AI tool that live fact-checks YouTube videos in real time. It's a visionary technology that analyzes and verifies claims made in social media videos in real time, in a moment where more and more people are getting their information from videos streamed in social media settings, and as trust in media hits record lows and nearly 4 in 10 young adults get their news from influencers. Avi Tuschman is a Stanford StartX entrepreneur with more than a decade of experience building AI companies. In the first half of his career, he specialized in international political risk analysis, working across private sector, multilateral, applied, and academic settings. His research and book on the science underlying human political bias have been featured in mainstream and peer-reviewed media in 25 countries. Hi, Avi.
Hi, Deb.
So, Avi, I want to just kind of start where you and I connected. Initially, you had contacted me at a point in time where I was the Belfer Fellow at the Center for Technology and Society at the ADL, studying questions of misinformation and disinformation. You subsequently came in and led a delightful seminar for my data science and human values class. And so we've had a bit of conversation back and forth between then and now. And I've always been kind of blown away by your career. You started off as an evolutionary anthropologist advising heads of state, and you have transitioned that trajectory to being an AI entrepreneur and now a founder of Cricket, which is a fact-checking app for video. So what's the through line that you would draw? What connects all of it?
Well, thanks first off for your kind words, Deb. And I would say that the through line is risk management, but just applied to different layers of human life. So early on as an evolutionary anthropologist, I was trying to understand a deep risk factor for societies, which is why smart people look at the same world and form totally different political realities. So that question took me into the international political risk work, including advising private sector executives, heads of state, working in multilaterals, and also even in think tanks with some of the world's leading democracy theorists, which was interesting and influential. And then, of course, eventually to publishing a book on the science underlying human political bias. For the past decade of my career, though, as you mentioned, I've been a Stanford StartX entrepreneur and building AI companies that quantify risk just in more concrete systems. So I started off modeling the psychometric traits in large populations. And then later on, that turned into modeling actuarial loss using big behavioral data at the individual level. And most recently, and pertinent, I guess, to our chat is Cricket dot AI with the IT spelling at the end. And our mission is to help people make healthier decisions by turning noisy social feeds into clear signals drawn from open source intelligence. So I look at Cricket really as the same risk management muscle. It just pointed at what I think is the most underpriced risk on earth right now, which is information risk. So, as you've all already pointed out, if you flood the world with information, the truth actually tends to sink a lot of times. And our media ecosystem right now is really defined by no barriers to entry. So, everyone's talking at once, and we've got these algorithms amplifying high arousal content just to get people's attention. And you can do that by amygdala hijack or rage baiting or promoting content that's just too outrageous or too good to be perfectly true. And I think the take home point for people is that in a collapsing information environment, trust plummets. And it's not just about getting bad opinions. You actually get some pretty severe risks like bad health decisions, declining mental health, bad financial decisions at a very large scale, and civic decay. You really get a whole hot mess of both personal and national security risks. And so ultimately, we're trying to provide some open source intel for everyday people in the medium that's shaping them the most, which is persuasive video.
And I guess I wanted to get right to the core of it. You mentioned, your career trajectory starting off in ways that are directly tied to our civic leadership, our government, our democracy, and now you're working in in the tech space to develop a technology in the context of intervening into a economy of misinformation and disinformation. And so that our listeners have a sense of the direct connection between those two things, how do you see the relationship between democracy on the one hand and information risk on the other?
Well, I think that kind of pertains to the trust crisis underneath everything else. And what first comes to mind in that question, that very important question that you posed, is the words of Filipina Nobel Peace Laureate Maria Ressa, who I think said it perfectly. Without facts, you can't have truth. Without truth, you can't have trust. And without trust, we have no shared reality, no democracy, and it becomes impossible to deal with the world's existential problems. The reason why I think she nailed it is that right now we're in the 20th straight year of what political scientists describe as a global democratic recession, which started with the explosive growth of social media in the mid 2000s. And in particular, indices like Freedom House look at dozens of countries around the world and many different parts of democracy. And the number of those dimensions are commonly sort of underestimated in the popular conception, but there are a lot of different pieces. And things have been moving in the wrong direction for the logic that I think Maria Ressa pointed out. Just to dive a tiny bit deeper, the other thing I'd add is that people don't normally think like spreadsheets, right? So it's not so information is critical to this challenge. We think in stories, and the other thing that's true and I think underappreciated and super important is that we're suggestible, and quite a lot more than we like to admit. For most of human history, that I don't think that was a bug. That suggestibility was actually a feature because we lived in small communities with really strong reputational information, right? So everybody knew how reliable you were. The difference is that today we spend enormous amounts of time in digital environments where we're subjective to a fire hose of the world's most talented persuasion professionals. I mean, literally the world's best storytellers and marketers and ideologues are beamed into our consciousness. They're optimized by algorithms and with really minimal reputational cost and countless conflicts of interest with the truth. So that mix, which is story, and within story, we've got these evolved sensitivities to really high consequence topics like politics, sex, and violence that can distort things if there's too much focus on them. And we've got the suggestibility and then that technological optimization for engagement. That's why misinformation is spreading so well, and why it's not just about like bad opinions. It's really a high performance persuasion system and and a new risk landscape.
Yeah, I think this is really key and something that I've been thinking about for a very long time. As I mentioned, you and I met originally in the context of a fellowship that I was having, pursuing at ADL, where I was working on building technologies and structuring legislation, as well as engaging with tech companies on questions about content moderation related to misinformation and disinformation. And just to give listeners a shared vocabulary, misinformation refers to information that is false or inaccurate. Disinformation refers to information that is deliberately false or misleading with the intent to mislead an audience. And to give our listeners a sense of the scope of the problem, misinformation and disinformation are problems in the first place, not just because they pollute our information environment or because they lead people to take actions that might be harmful to themselves or harmful to society at large, or even simply because it manipulates people into behaving in a way that is not in their best interest, but is instead in the interest of the people who are spreading misinformation. But it's particularly important because misinformation and disinformation spreads, and I'm citing a statistics here from an MIT study on this issue, 6 times faster than real information. You cited our proclivity towards stories and storytelling, and the reason that misinformation and disinformation spreads 6 times faster than real information is because facts are usually not that sexy. They are explanations of what's going on, and they can be tedious. and involve understanding the intricacies of large bureaucracies, which are not that interesting. But mis and disinformation, however, often involves stories that are more interesting. They involve conspiracies or plot twists or turns that are much more imaginative. They simply just make better stories. So I guess I'm wondering in that context how you think about the argument that I sometimes hear from people in tech companies that if we just let the invisible hand of the information economy, you know, allow for better and worse ideas to sort themselves out in this free market economy of ideas, that we should allow all ideas to kind of intermingle in that economy. Is there a way to have this invisible hand marketplace, or do we actually need somebody intervening and sticking their thumb on the scale, so to speak?
Yeah, that's the huge question. So I want to approach that in two different ways. Like one, challenge that assumption, and two, describe how a free marketplace can be used to solve it in a different way than we're doing right now. So in the first part, the idea that just putting more information out there historically it gets to accurate results and doesn't create risk is, I think, very historically naive. And I'd recommend anybody that is interested to read Yuval Harari's latest book called Nexus. And he's an excellent historian, and he just shows the history of information systems and that their purpose is to organize people, and that there's some types of information systems that do get closer approximations of truth, but they have particular characteristics like being about replicability and open-ended and living systems. And there's other ones that do the exact opposite, right? So you get like witch trials when the book gets published, and science and a lot of things. So it's super naive. Now, the problem that we have today, it's not really a free market problem. I think it's an actors and incentives and like a legal and a regulatory problem. Okay, so we're kind of stuck in a bind where we're thinking in terms of two actors, and it's a totally false dichotomy, right? The first actor is the social platforms themselves, and the other one is governments. And I think as Steve Rosenbaum, who's a media theorist and author, pointed out, we really have like a missing actor, and it doesn't work to have companies whose main incentives are entertainment and advertising, right? Managing billion-dollar businesses to be concerned about factuality. That's not their incentive. That's not their business model. They're in the advertising and entertainment business. And that's really a headache when you're all over the world. They have very strong economic interests. On the other side, you have governments that, it's hard for them. I want to be careful with my words. It's difficult for them to be fast enough and sophisticated enough and scalable enough to do that. And then government regulation comes with its own risks to limit free speech, and something called like jawboning, where there's a lot of uh, attempts to regulate free speech that are for political ends, so that they have a political incentive. What we really need are third parties that can be middleware, whose main incentives and business model is much more simple. It's trust and it's factuality, and it doesn't. So I think that's it comes into like what we're doing with cricket, right? It's optional. It works within the existing system. So I think there are ways to fix this, but you need a third party, and it has to be technological, and it has to follow the evidence. If persuasion happens in videos, which is true, we're absolutely in the video age. We've got 75% of global mobile traffic at the end of last year that's video. It's not just a format; it's the default uh, interface with information today, and it's the most persuasive medium that we have. Not just because of the scale, but because video hits like, multiple channels, pacing, facial expressions, tone, music, and it creates parasocial trust. Like you feel like you know the person, even though you don't that well. And that's really great for learning, and it's really great for manipulation. And it's very hard to fact check traditionally, and that's why we focused on that. So really what you need is a third party, and to ensure that if you wanna take the free market approach, then that's fine, but that means there has to be a space for middleware, and you can't have, you can't block that out. That would be disingenuous, and we just need to be very clear, like, this is not gonna be solved by gigantic parties whose main business model and incentives are either economic or financial. There has to be a room for a third party whose incentives are or factuality. The fundamental, deeper philosophical problem, and I think it's pretty obvious, but it's worth stating that almost all the largest platforms in the world today, and largest websites, probably with the exception of Wikipedia, are based on popularity and engagement algorithms. And there just is a very awkward and, difficult relationship between factuality and popularity. Those don't always get along very well. And so that's where the issue is.
You said a lot of things there that I want to put together and tease out a little bit. I'm particularly interested in the dynamic that you pointed out in terms of video content that makes it a particularly potent form of storytelling and a particularly vexing form of media circulation to be able to fact check. And I wonder if I could ask you to put a little bit of a finer point on it. You mentioned the fact that many people, perhaps most people, are getting their information from videos, that videos tend to have a sheen of veracity attached to them, that we might say colloquially, seeing is believing. And if we say that for photographs, then even the more so, video seems to have that kind of veracity built into it, so that people look at a video and they say, well, it can't, how could this be a made up story? This appears that it has really happened. Of course, I think some of that is now mitigated by the amount of video that we now expect to be treated with AI or conjured up in entirety from AI. But I guess I'm asking you, putting all of that together and perhaps building on that, what makes video a particular problem for misinformation and disinformation and its spread?
Yeah. Well, again, it's a combination of scale and psychology. It's that 75% of mobile traffic globally is video in the US. We're talking about streaming has become the single biggest share of TV viewing. So it's everywhere. And I'm sure, people are like reading less text. The trust in traditional news media, including, printed newspapers and digital newspapers, is the lowest it's been recorded by Gallup at like 28% last year. So people are turning more and more to alternative sources that are worse. So there's a vicious cycle. And then on the psychology side, it's all those touch points like facial expressions, feeling like the speaker, or that trust. And then it happens very fast. So video also hides claims in a way that text just doesn't do. Right? Like a bold claim can be slipped into a fast moving narrative with really confident delivery. And the viewer doesn't pause to check it out because the platform's job is to keep just to keep you watching and to select that very, very, very small percentage of all the possible videos that is adapted to retain you and keep you engaged. And it's I don't want to blame the victim too much, but it's a structural problem before it's even a moral problem. It's like there's research showing that people are capable of redirecting their attention, but it just doesn't happen without that structure. In other words, there's no speed bump in your consciousness saying, "Well, wait a sec, should you question that?" Stanford research shows that fewer than 20% of American high school students are questioning false claims in social media because there's no structure to encourage that. And other research shows that when people are prompted to kind of check things out, then that can reduce the spread of misinformation. So it's not just an ideological, or like a moral problem. So I think the idea of cricket is that if a video is where persuasion happens, then verification practice has to happen there too. So that's why we, overlay fact checks like subtitles in real time. So the brain does get that speed bump right when the claim is made in real time, not like 2 days later in a debunk thread that very few people read.
And this is an audio medium, so perhaps it's not best suited to helping our listeners understand how this works. But I'm wondering if you can, in an audio format, do your best to describe what Cricut looks like, everything from how you download it to what it looks like, or how a viewer would see it and interact with Cricut in real time while watching a video.
Sure. Yeah. It'd be great to take a step back and kind of explain some of the basics. So it's very easy to download on a desktop browser like Chrome or Edge. If you go to Cricut, Crickit AI, and then it's just a simple add-on. And when it's built for YouTube first, and we'll be expanding to other platforms. But when you're watching a video on YouTube, for example, there's patent pending technology that automatically extracts the most important, currently up to 3 claims per each 2 minute that are most consequential, and then fact checks those using a live web search with reliability guardrails, based on third party reliability ratings of major organizations. And then it will read, 10, 20, 30, 40 different independent sources, do news desk style cross checking, and provide a very easy to digest, quick, succinct write up of about 40 to 50 words that adds more context. So even when it's correct, it's adding more information that's really interesting and valuable. And then there are three what we call ground truth links, which are the most reliable and relevant ones, where you can do what's called lateral reading and go to the Associated Press and go to other sources that are high reliability, and read about it and check it for yourself. So that transparency is important. And then we also surface those third party reliability ratings, so you can see like what is the reliability rating of the Wall Street Journal or compared with Reuters, etc. We're within a few days of releasing it in 50 languages, which we're excited about. And we're also adding the ability to very quickly fact check any part of the video with a few keyboard shortcuts, which is a really powerful feature. And then you can also share the video fact check experience with other people. And what that means is, as you're watching the video, you get a subtitle like experience that's synchronized. So someone says something, and as they're saying it, you see a beautiful overlay with one of 5 different categories of how factually substantiated it is. Is it correct, partly right, misrepresented, mostly wrong, or false? Or in some rare cases, there's just not enough evidence, and why, and where's the proof? So it goes very quickly to from viral claim to evidence that you can verify for yourself, that you don't have to take our word for it. And it's just automating a massive amount of research. And I think one of the coolest things it does is how many sources it looks at and how diverse they are from different parts of the world. We're using depersonalized search engines, right? And delocalized ones. So it's really treating information in a way that's a lot more objective and doing the opposite of what most companies do. I mean, we're surrounded by technologies that are really just trying to make as much money as possible. And so personalization and bias, and in some rare cases, like intentional political bias, are actually big problems. And it seems like to a lot of people like those are inherently necessary. And actually they're not. It's surprisingly easy to remove these biases to an extent that's actually much less biased than a human being, with an error rate in today's technologies if you do it in the right way. And I'll be the first to say there's a pretty wide range of quality in the AI products out there right now. We've got stuff that's being given away for free at massive scale that's not good enough. And then we've got at the same time, like almost every clinical physician in 190 countries using software called Up to Date that uses AI and grounding, similar to what we do, and it works brilliantly well. We've got self-driving cars that are 7 times safer than people. Is that hard on our egos? Like, yeah, but is it hard to process? Yes. In fact, we're building a tool that protects people from other misuses of the same underlying technological power. So I just want to give some appropriate nuance to it. I don't want to come off as being like a techno optimist. It's complicated. Our tool works very, very well. We're seeing in perfect context situations in the benchmark, we're doing pretty close to 99% accuracy in an earlier version. So it's really quite quite amazing experience. One of the largest tricks that misinformation plays on us is to persuade us that it's not really relevant to us personally. That it's kind of an issue of people that don't know which conspiracy theories, how they work, or don't understand vaccines. And that's a problem. That's actually a really easy problem to solve for cricket. My message is that think of it not as conspiracies or lies, they're out there, But the bigger problem for sophisticated consumers of information and for leaders, and that's every one of you listening out there because you're a leader over your own life. You have your own executive function. For other people, you're managing a family, you're managing a job, a company, an organization. So we all are forced to be leaders. And that's really hard to collect a lot of information about the world. The big problem for ordinary people is that we don't have a complete factual record. And most of the time, even in the best quality news or media that we don't even think needs fact checking, is it's what goes silently missing. I'll give you two really concrete examples. Like one is a David Attenborough video, and he's a hero. I love him. I hate to even criticize him, but just to show that even if like a saint like Attenborough could get something wrong, just to give you like the spirit of that is to understand how prevalent these problems are. But just in one video, he's saying that the red kangaroo stands 8 feet before you, right? Well, that's just not that just doesn't check out with zoology. It could be 8 feet long, or in another one, he mentions the average depth of the Arctic Ocean is such and such, but it's actually the most deep point. That's totally trivial. There's other cases where it intersects with health where it's not trivial at all, or even with history. Like the BBC saying today's the 80th anniversary of when the Allies marched in and liberated Auschwitz. Well, that's partly right. The problem is that in the viewers' heads, they think of American and British troops marching in and liberating Auschwitz. It was, in fact, the Soviet army who were like allied. But there's subtle things like this that reshape our memory, that reshape our understanding at the most trusted sources. And so, to be good leaders, we need intelligence, and ordinary people deserve to get a more complete factual record that highlights where things aren't certain, where there's divergent opinions, where things aren't fully resolved. And that's the way that well-run corporations and governments do better at predicting the future. And leaders there should be aligning their stakeholders' interests with that future. So when I talk to young people, I tell them, look, you've got a lot of work. It's not just about understanding your values, where you think you fit on the political spectrum, or understanding who you think is the most persuasive. You can't be a good leader based on partisan feelings. You need to think about what are your long-term interests and objectives. They're going to be different from all the ideologues and people selling you stuff and convincing you that it's easy and all you have to do is this one trick, and then whatever, and after 3 days you could do this, and after 7 days you have golden wings, and on day 10 you're flying, or whatever, right. You need to get the full picture. So that's what we're passionate about. We're staunchly nonpartisan, and just want to help people make smarter, better decisions with a model that's 100% focused on that.
And I think that's I mean, I'm on board with everything that you said, so yes, and the snafu, as I see it, is that you are talking to and looking to ask somebody voluntarily to download your product. And, you're gonna get every perspicacious, discerning person who really wants to know what your fact checker will deliver in terms of, the, correction to any video that they see. But there's a large swath of the population, I think, who is more interested in the good story. That was the problem that we initially laid out. And so I guess the question is your ambition to allow this product to be downloaded with the agency of the user to make the proactive decision to fact check the video that's coming their way? Or is your ultimate goal to have platforms institute this as part of the product that runs alongside every single video that comes on? Or is there some mixture in between? Because as I laid out, I think the problem is there's going to be some people who say, yes, I absolutely want to know. I'm a discerning viewer and I want the real truth and I want it to come in every single video. And then I think you have a large swath of the population who isn't particularly interested in that, right? I mean, I think of the person who watches Candace Owens, and I think about how many people want a fact checker to run alongside the video of Candace Owens, identifying every single time she tells a mistruth or a truth that, I don't know, I would assume even they might start to say the man, right, is wanting them to swallow rather than the real truth that Candace Owens delivers. So, how do you kind of square that circle?
Yeah. Well, that's a very valid question. First, I'd say that we measure success one person at a time, and we think early, like high school and undergraduate education, are very important times when people can train their minds in how to think. And flexible adults can also change their mind with new information. That's also very important for executive function and leadership and being successful. So this is really, we've got a great endorsement from an editor in chief now, and from many educators and a leading public health figure. But Deb, like to answer your question more directly,
Mhm.
I want to do that by pointing to the name of our company, which is Cricket. It's misspelled a little bit, but sort of like cricket to believe it. It was a busy space. But the reason for that name, it's an homage to the story of Pinocchio, the 1883 novel by Carlo Collodi. Now, at face value, that feels a little bit fanciful, right? Like, what are you mentioning this children's fantasy for? The reason, though, is deadly serious. So, The Adventures of Pinocchio is probably the third most translated book in history. Like, it's up there 1 or 2, well, probably 2 after the Bible, right? So how do you explain that? The reason, in my view, is that human societies universally have a conflict between wanting to believe what things that are too good to be true, and, like, needing to kind of do the hard work, go to school, face up to reality, and honor the truth. And our enduring value systems at their core, from the great faiths to science, really honor truth and make that important at the core. At the same time, history is littered with like popular fads that kind of go against that, and it's a perennial struggle. Now, in that story, you've got a lot of people that wanna go to the Paese di Balocche, or the Disney's Pleasure Island, and, they get donkey fever, and some of them don't come back from getting donkey fever, and they don't earn their humanity, and it's really easy, even when we're trying today, to have our strings pulled by people that wanna manipulate our attention and sell us things, and we're just being flooded by the best people in the world at doing that in the lowest accountability ecosystem. But that's gonna change. We're at an inflection point right now where the technology is changing, and it's changing the communication system. And as the Marshall McLuhan pointed out, that the medium is the message, right? Like the medium is changing. That's going to change society and governance at its core. How's it changing? It's going to get much, much better and much, much worse at the same time, right? We're going to have technologies like Cricket that can show serious people that it's possible to get highly accurate intelligence. And again, I just want to emphasize, we're not trying to win arguments. We're trying to inform better thinking for people that want to make better decisions. It's not like a gotcha machine. Well, there's uncertainty. It's not resolved, or it is resolved. And here's how we know. That's what we're trying to do. Will people continue to get donkey fever? Yes, we can't solve that problem. But if we can get a few more people to make a better, decision that in one of these critical areas. I mean, we've got 60% of Americans that feel regret, or nearly 60%, for bad financial decisions made due to online information. We have 319,000 people, according to Brown and Microsoft Health, who died due to vaccine hesitancy in a little over a year from COVID. I mean, we've got a mental health crisis that the Surgeon General pointed out, that more than 3 hours in social media is associated with double anxiety and depression risk, and teens are averaging at 4.8 right now. So I think that this is a spiraling, like, vicious cycle. It's getting worse. We've got 40% of young people now getting news regularly from influencers, which are literally the leading vector of misinformation. Our goal is just to show that a different way is possible, and to help as many people as we can to strengthen their thinking. And I don't think you need to get everybody. I also don't think you need to. you need to like force tech companies to change. Other people are working on this. I know the EU is thinking about this very carefully, and I did think middleware is a very very important solution. So just making sure that there's a safe space for middleware is is very nice because it doesn't require any significant changes necessarily to current business models, and it keeps with kind of free market. The efficiencies and power of a free market. It's just following the spirit of that a little bit more because there are a lot of ways where the market is not as free as it's portrayed to be, and that's definitely can be an issue.
You mentioned vaccine and health and information health around vaccines, I should say, rather, and the unfortunate circumstances in which people in a politicized information economy of vaccine mis and disinformation made sometimes lethal choices in the context of determining whether or not to vaccinate themselves and their family. And that led me to kind of want to ask you a question about what counts as information that's true or false to begin with. The reason I ask this question is that I think that there are a lot of disingenuous arguments about why we should not have checks on misinformation and disinformation. But I think that there's also some arguments that I take seriously about why we should not have checks on misinformation and disinformation. For one thing, to say it colloquially, today's disinformation, what we think is untrue today, might be tomorrow's truth. So some of the great discoveries that I'm thinking about in the context of this statement across time have been decried at the time as disinformation, from Socrates to Galileo to the scientific theories that argued that COVID might have come from a lab and not from a wet market and from a bat. And in each of these respective cases, consensus about what was, quote, true information ended up stifling important scientific thought. And our current political norms and biases and institutions may also have their own reasons for wanting to limit the kinds of changes to official versions of things. So how do you think about the tension between wanting people to be able to make unpopular arguments in service of challenging the status quo and creating a marketplace of ideas in which marginal ideas, ideas that at the time may be, cast off as false, can still participate in that marketplace without being flagged as misinformation or disinformation? Especially, I'm thinking in the context of those moments where alternative theories fly in the face of popular understandings or institutional backings, and of the obvious importance of stopping bad faith, erroneous, or malicious claims in a circulation environment where they spread rapidly. So, I guess, how do you hold that tension, and how, in creating a technology that intervenes into misinformation and disinformation, do you not further limit or further, blacklist unpopular information that at the time is claimed to be false, but that may later be understood to be true, or that actually has some merit or bearing even at the time, but is for institutional or governmental reasons, cast off as not true.
Sure. Well, super important question. First off, open inquiry is very important, and I'll circle back to how we honor that. But I'd like to just level set where I think we actually are today, which is I believe we have the exact opposite problem today. Like the risk isn't that minority views don't get platformed. In fact, I think they're massively overrepresented. Just to throw out a number, like there's tons of these studies, but like 25% of the data or content related to asthma, just to look at one study in memory on TikTok, it contains misinformation, and that 25% of content is also massively overviewed. So that's a problem. In fact, I'd say the risk that dissenting views don't get platformed is the lowest it's ever been in history. The central risk, in my view, is that non-experts do their own research and focus disproportionately on algorithmically amplified fringe ideas that evoke more intrigue or outreach or hope, in spite of being at odds with expert positions and consensus reality. So that's the risk we're solving. At the same time, the open source intelligence engine that we've built reviews enough high relevant sources pertaining to each specific claim that there's plenty of room for minority positions to be represented. In particular, like the partly right, misrepresented, and mostly wrong labels can really help with those nuances. And our study shows that people are much safer relying on that. We've been able to estimate a reduction in misrepresented and false claims by over 30x compared with not using Cricket. But we definitely need room for serious minority views and unresolved questions. And that's really, this technology is excellent at surfacing those. It does a brilliant job at that. And facts do change over time. And that's why Cricket's fact checks use live web searches. So that pertains to a really interesting topic called the half-life of facts. And one thought experiment you can do is, like, imagine you got your medical degree in hepatology in the 1960s, and then straight away you go into a coma for 45 years. When you wake up, half of what you knew about liver disease is not correct anymore. Or in the 20s, the half-life of an engineering degree was 35 years. In the 60s, it was 10 years. And then in this century, it became 5 years, and God only knows how short it is today. If you're talking about like the half-life of facts on today's news, those are going to be even shorter. And that's why it's important for science to be a living system that's based on replicability as opposed to based on authority. Like, there's other information systems that are based on authority, right? Because the supreme leader said so, right? Or and don't question it. That's not how efficient, powerful scientific processes work. So Cricket's a scientific process. It's open-ended. It's based on, cross-checking and replicating high reliability sources, looking at large numbers. There's power in larger numbers. So when most people are reading the news, they're reading one or two sources. They're usually not reading 20, 30, 40 sources to get one fact check right. And if they are, they're usually not reading in multiple languages and geographies, right? So that's where the power of numbers come in. It's just easy to find overlap and non-overlap in serious sources when you do that, and to find what's missing or what's still unresolved. So that's the way I look at it. I think open inquiry is really, really important, but that's totally different than like open season for claims that fail basic evidentiary tests. Most of the time, the sort of consensus opinion is right. There, uh, there are times when it's wrong. Like, to be a successful entrepreneur, like, you have to know when most people think something that's true isn't actually true, and that's really, really hard. I want to give some credit to Peter Thiel on that philosophical point, at least as part of his Zero to One book, which is a very good book, very, very intelligent, insightful book. But you know, so to find new things in science or to innovate new things, it's possible for people, you know, to come up with new ideas. Now, usually those are people that are familiar with the field, not always. I mean, you can have a guy in a patent clerk in Switzerland or in a customs desk or whatever, Ramanujan, you have absolute geniuses who come up with things. And usually those are recognized over some reasonable amount of time by people that are inside the system. So right now we've got it upside down. We've got massive, massive amounts of people with no background at all looking at ideas that are just good stories by people that are just asking questions about very serious life and death issues. And it's so disproportionate. So I think just to, I don't know, put some color on the magnitude of the actual risk. That's how I think of it as a sort of risk management professional. Right now, I encourage people to use Cricket and to spend a significant amount of time. It's actually very nuanced, very sophisticated, and it takes some time to appreciate how nuanced it is. It's pretty impressive. So you will see minority views in there, and you will see disagreements. There's a tremendous amount of uncertainty, right? Like, a world expert in AI could say, we're going to get AGI over the next 5 years or whatever. That's going to be misrepresented. Not because he or she is right or wrong. It's just that if you have a more complete record of all the other experts, there's huge uncertainty. I mean, we don't know what the probability of nuclear conflict is in the next 5 years. There's a lot of experts with a lot of ranging opinions. It's actually important to understand the range of expert estimates. So those kind of questions and the way that cricket itself works kind of brings to mind one of the genius discoveries of Sir Francis Galton. He was at a country fair, and people were kind of guessing the weight of an ox, right, to win a prize or something. And he said, "Well, what if we look at everyone's guesses and we look at the median? And that way, like, it kind of peels away the high bias and the low bias." And in fact, that method got astoundingly close to the true weight of the animal. And so that was one of the first like discovery of the wisdom of the crowds. That doesn't always hold true, but for simple things like the weight of an animal or whether some, that 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 works much better than partisan feelings or just reading one or two sources. Every source has some amount of bias or omission or error or exaggeration because it's a better story. And you can't just have an old-fashioned news desk where they fact check everything because it's not entertaining. It doesn't compete with people's attention span. I mean, people almost go into like with dopamine withdrawal if you take their phone away from them and ask them to like talk at some times. So it's very hard um to compete. And that's why we're trying to work like within the existing system. I think there are other people that have other ideas that are more disruptive or harder to achieve, and some of them are good ideas, but I don't know, my bias is it's very hard to change things, even for the most powerful people in the world to do that, let alone for a, little person like me. So we just try to think like one step at a time, and your help's very valuable in helping to show people that something is in fact possible, right? That's the first step is the recognition that there's in, technology can achieve something different today than we thought was possible. And what are the implications? How can that help me personally? How can that help my children or my parents? We think of cricket as a flight simulator for critical thinking, right? If you're going to be a professor or fly an airplane or do other serious things or a doctor, like, of course you go to school, but you gotta get your hours, right? And yet we have young people that are spending 7,000 hours in this crazy persuasion environment during their high school career. 61% are not getting any even, like, media literacy training. The ones who are getting sort of a lot of it as a teach at once course for 5 or 6 hours, and it's not really that effective. So we want to accelerate getting a new skill. And I feel really positive about this. We're at a time when one of the biggest problems in education is de-skilling and offloading. And I'm concerned about that. Like I really am. If you could just like push a button and write a paper, why would you go through the mental challenge? And I remember in school learning how to write papers. Like I struggled with it and I kept working. It really helped my thinking. And I actually became a professional writer for some time, and it was hard, but it was so important. So the offloading of that's really big problem. Now, cricket, I think, is creating a brand new skill, which is real time reflexes, and it you can learn the ways that people persuade and manipulate much faster. If we're lucky, sometime in like middle age, by the time we've got gray hair and a bunch of scar tissue, if you're lucky, you get wisdom, but it's very expensive in terms of the cost that you're paying for it and the amount of years it takes, and not everyone gets it, right? And then you get older, and then you're susceptible all over again to certain kind of like elder abuse scams on social media. So it's really this enduring problem. And if we can teach young people, without them having to get old or without them having to go into a career in like law enforcement or intelligence and like get trained in interrogation or looking for these signs. I mean, it's very interesting just having technology where you can see as someone says something if it's factually substantiated. Our technology doesn't make any conclusions on intent, right? But you can see like micro expressions on someone's face, and there's sometimes when something's just an error, and there's sometimes where there are certain tells that maybe like poker players or interrogators or people that are just naturally good and sensitive to that can see it. But it's not easy to join those two worlds of information, right? Like, is the assertion true? And what's the body language? What's the behavior as it's being said? And of course, we have the very strong capacity that's adaptive for self-deception. So a lot of people saying things believe they're true. Like the Nobel laureate in economics at the most prestigious newspapers giving a talk about, how inflation is the most important thing in presidential administrations, and that's what led to the decline of the Lyndon Johnson administration. And it's not that he's wrong, but like he's an economist, and he didn't mention the Vietnam War, and like that's a major factor that needs to get considered as part of the full picture. So it's like there's so many different ways in which things are twisted, even at the highest levels, that is just helpful to have a fighting chance to even see what's going on. And it's just a remarkable, it's a fascinating experience. I use it every single day, and like some of the anecdotal evidence that we have, or is that once you use it for a while, if people feel uncomfortable looking at social video without it, like something critical is missing, and you just don't really know what you can trust. So I think that's a positive sign.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned a couple of things there that I wanted to ask you to expand on just briefly. What what does the technology do in instances where the facts may be debatable or the claim isn't a claim that can be is cleanly established by the facts? I mean, you mentioned a video where a Nobel Prize winning economist is talking about a topic and doesn't mention something important. Now, of course, in every single situation, there are permutations of things not talked about or claims that are important claims that can't be established by the fact. I sometimes like to say that anything worth really talking or about or debating is not a really cleanly factual topic. If I'm talking about whether or not this table is, ochre mahogany, that is a cleanly establishable fact. Folks can't see my table. It's clearly neither of the 2, but that's something that's very clean. But a more complex question such as, "Is eating animals moral?" For
Mm.
example, that's not something that we can determine using the facts, and to think, to have every single permutation of every single debate include everything that is not said or possible alternative, suggestions or possible alternative implicated facts. I'm trying not to use the word, alternative facts because that is a term that's been politicized, but you can see where I'm going with this because there are a lot of claims that just simply are not factual claims. Should we go to war in Iran? The war in Iran is a bad idea. The war in Iran is a good idea, right? That's not something
Well,
we
that
can
right, right. That
establish
and
using the facts.
sure, sure. Well, on that area, we're a little bit more of like an open source intelligence engine than just a fact checker, right? Like if the most consequential thing someone says on a news program, or in any program on any informational topic, is an opinion or a prediction about the future, or a military strategist saying, Ukraine should do this and that, there's not like a black and white factual answer in the way your table's made out of one kind of wood or another. However, there is a more complete factual record, and there is more of a consensus reality that can be checked out against, many, many other expert military strategists to see what the consensus reality is at that time. So in that way, cricket is able to say that opinion is generally accepted, or most people disagree with that, but some people agree. The way you described, like, whether eating meat is wrong or not, would be correct. You said it's a very complex human moral issue with a lot of different perspective on. That's correct. Now, if you say, it's always immoral, or it's simple, or whatever, that's going to be misrepresented because you're omitting important parts of the full story that someone, an objective person would want to be aware of before to think about it in a more effective way.
I guess the
Yeah.
question is, well, how does cricket decide what is misinformation and disinformation in the first place? Is it purely, weighing the ox and finding out what the media and guesses, the wisdom of crowds? How does that work on a technical level? And how did you make decisions about what would count as misinformation or disinformation?
Let me answer the question I think you're getting at. But first, we don't distinguish between misinformation and disinformation just because we can't know the intent. Other tools may be able to do that, measuring, like networks and how coordinated
Yeah.
certain
Just to clarify,
actors.
I wasn't asking to distinguish between those 2. How do you decide which things are factual and which belongs into either of those categories or both of those categories?
Right, right. So the way that one of those 5 labels is applied, and there are strong evidence gates where, there's not enough evidence and the system isn't forced to apply a label. But the way that it happens is it's looking at the more complete factual record. It's looking at the different how much overlap and non-overlap is there in authoritative sources, and to what extent something is a resolved issue or an ongoing unresolved issue. And that's part of why I'm saying it's great to use it for some extended period of time, because it actually has a lot of nuance in, if someone says, like, the corridor for such and such a weather phenomenon is, whatever, like, a kilometer long, and it looks at all the other weather reports and it says, well, it's actually, some say it's 1.2 or 1.5. It'll say that's mostly right, but there's other estimates, right? It'll get like a 70. It'll get, partly right. Now, if you say, let's say, like, a government minister makes a claim, and then there's major important reliable newspapers that support it and that don't support it, then it's going to say misrepresented if it's unresolved, right? If it is resolved among authorities, right? Like, it could change in the future, but right now there's huge scientific consensus on, whether MMR vaccines cause autism or not. There's some dissenting views, but they're not serious views. They're not backed by data. That's easy. Like, that is resolved, and that would get a false if you said that, and it would point to the reliable resources. So it does a very good job of understanding how much overlap and non-overlap, and being able to decide whether it's partly right or mostly wrong or misrepresented, and explaining why. So that's what's pretty cool, is that ability to think in terms of nuance and overlap, and to be a living system that will keep refreshing and keep updating, so that our approximation of truth, facts are kind of like our best approximation of truth at a given time, and require a lot of data and high reliability sources to get right. And that's where cricket's a massive help, and where it's so hard. Like, it's a very, very unfight today in the current media environment. Like, we honestly, we just don't stand a chance. No, no, maybe there's some area where you have super deep expertise, but the amount of information that we need to make executive decisions, like, leadership's about being a generalist, and it's really, really hard as a generalist to know when something's true or not, and which authority to listen to. And the video media makes that much, much harder than it's ever been. So I think you could really have a fighting chance of just, I mean, we're struggling to understand what is even, like, the consensus reality at a given point of time on important issues. So that problem's is much easier to solve today than it was. And the threat is accelerating. The severity and the prevalence of the information risk is getting worse. Misinformation and disinformation were ranked as the number one most severe short-term global threat in 2025 and 2024 by the World Economic Forum's Global Risks Report. And there's some really sophisticated people behind that. I think they got it right. It's really a serious problem. They also put societal polarization as a major threat as well, and that's intimately related as well.
And I guess we have time for one last question, so I'll ask you, are you optimistic about solving this problem? And if so, why? If not, why not?
Yeah. So I think yes, sort of conditionally optimistic, and that gets back to the story about our name. I think no one wants to be misled, right? Just because our values are rooted in the more enduring value systems. Again, like, from great faith to science, that we honor truth. We are being pulled in a lot of different directions, and there's always fads that, you don't have to do the hard work, and, just listen to one person, or it's simple, or someone else will solve things for us. But it is important to make sure that we make good decisions and do the work, and do reliable research, or at least have it done for us, and then actually read it and stay curious. So will everyone choose that path? No. Like some people will always get donkey fever. This is the real world, right? Like I'm doing the opposite of making like a false promise, and it's not as nice. I don't want to like sugarcoat it, or I don't want to be unrealistic. It's on us to protect our own interests. So some people will always trade truth for short-term comfort and thrills that have long-term consequences. But I think optimism doesn't require 100% conversion. If we make it easier for people listening right now to redeem that full humanity and remove some of those like puppet strings that people are pulling on, and just make one better health decision, one better financial decision, or a better civic decision, then that's enough. That justifies building this.
Avi, thank you so much.
Thank you, Deb. Really appreciate it.